Now, you've probably seen footage of the Sunderland riots that saw a gang of thugs, every one of them a coward if he had him on his own, dragged the poor driver of that car out, punching him in the head. And this guy then attempted to belt him with a metal bar. David Wilkinson, his name. He also attacked the police. He got 6 years. Good. John Honey, 25, got nearly 5 years for the same attack. A sentence hearing earlier in the week for that job had to be adjourned after a probation officer described how Honey had asked him, quotes, if he wanted his autograph because he was famous, which the court heard could have undermined Honey's claim of being genuinely remorseful. You don't say. Then we've got... I'm reading this out because I just think it was excellent. This is the judge presiding over the Plymouth riot hearings, and he tore into the defendant's excuses. So you've got two guys, John Cann and Ryan Bailey, both plead guilty to violent disorder. And then the judge, Robert Linford, first of all, he rounds on Cann, who had criticised the police during his interview for wasting taxpayers' money arresting rioters. So let's look at how the taxpayer's been funding your activities over the last 38 years, said the judge. Let's see what you've cost the country. You've got 10 aliases, 4 fictitious birth dates. You've been convicted of 170 offences. You've been convicted of theft, arson, taking cars, handling stolen goods, obtaining by deception, burglary, dangerous driving, possessing bladed articles. In all, you've received sentences totaling 357 months in prison, many of them concurrent. In other words, nearly 30 years. That, Mr. Cann, is what you've been costing this country, and you sit there in that interview and saw fit to be critical of others. I wonder what drew him to rioting. The way Nigel Farage and others on the right would have you believe it is that in amongst the thuggery and the violence, the rioters, there were true patriots with real concerns about migration. But it's interesting, the courts, everyone that appears in front of the beak appears to be a convicted, full of thuggery and hate. There are women, they've been involved too. The 53-year-old Judy Sweeney, she got 15 months for posting that mosques shouldn't be protected and should be blown up with the adults in it. But thanks to some excellent analysis by the Financial Times' John Burn-Murdoch earlier in the year, I am aware of a gender split when it comes to the sort of gravitational political pull, if you like, of the right and left. And I was absolutely unaware of this, that Generation Z, unlike any previous generation, is more divided than anything before. Males and females moving apart, attracted to opposite ends of the political spectrum. I'm hearing somebody saying, well, prove it. Okay, well, the facts are these. In the US of A, women aged 18 to 30 are now 30 percentage points more liberal than their male contemporaries, a gap that opened up in just 6 years. Germany also shows a 30-point gap between increasingly conservative young men and progressive female contemporaries. In Poland last year, half of men aged 18 to 21 backed the hard-right Confederation Party compared to just a sixth of young women. There are even bigger gaps to be found in Asia, South Korea. Even in the UK, there's a gap, 25 points. Why? Why are young men and women going in a polar opposite direction when it comes to their politics? I've been reading around it. A lot of people are arguing that Me Too changed everything. It enabled women. It gave women a voice. Does that resonate with you? 03456060973 is the number. And then I've got other questions. Do we think, I think the data is overwhelmingly, it's point proven, but are we looking at just a blip in human history, or is this a sign that things are not going to be, maybe never going to be the same again? Have smartphones, the isolating effect they have on us, otherwise social human beings, are they responsible for this political divergence? In the US, UK, Germany, young women take far more liberal positions on immigration and racial justice than young men, while older age groups remain pretty much evenly matched. Why? 03456060973 is the number. Well, I'm rather hoping my first guest is going to set us off on a clear path, because it is that journalist I was just referring to, John Burn-Murdoch from the Financial Times. Good morning to you, John.
Morning, Matthew.
I saw this at the beginning of the year and I found it absolutely fascinating, and it's sort of lodged in my brain ever since. And as the months go by, more truth seems to add to it. What attracted you to this phenomenon? How did you become aware of it?
I think it's just something that I'd been sort of aware of in the background for a while, which that I was seeing more and more polls come out showing, who was intending to vote for which parties in different countries. And there was this fairly consistent pattern that if you looked at older age groups, men and women of the same age had pretty similar voting habits and that sort of thing. But when you looked at people in their late teens, their 20s, maybe early 30s, you started to see this sort of divergence going on with young women. moving towards more explicitly progressive parties. So in the UK, that's not just the likes of Labour, but the Greens, and young men being slightly more likely to move towards parties on the opposite flank. And I thought, what does this look like for other countries, and how big a thing is it?
I'm going to ask you the reasons why. I was talking to my producer Elliot, wondering whether this comes down to such simple things as sort of women are. If we were to reduce it right to basics, that women are biologically programmed to be nurturers, men broadly to be protectors. Nurturing leans towards the more socialist, protecting leans towards the more nationalist. Is there anything to, you're smiling at me, is that really oversimplifying things?
Well, I think one thing to say straight out of the gate is, if it were to do with these sort of core biology and psychological difference, as it were, then we would have seen the same pattern.
Before.
Exactly,
Yes.
Exactly. But historically, actually, something I think a lot of people don't realise is that we used to actually see the opposite gap. It used to be that men were more likely to vote for parties of the left and women conservative parties. And yeah, there's a huge body of research on this. There's some researchers. There's a researcher called Rosalind Shorrocks, who's done some great work on this. And one of the reasons for that was that because, of course, back in the day, parties of the left were your sort of workers' parties. So a lot of men were in unions, and then, they were voting for the likes of Labour, of course, and whereas women were probably more heavily involved in the church,
Gotcha.
which is towards the right. Yeah, so I think what that gets us onto something, which is one of the things that we need to talk about here. The parties themselves have changed a bit, right? You've gone from the old divide between sort of workers' parties of the left and more sort of family-centric parties on the right, to the modern, slightly more populist and conservative, always been conservative, but the more populist right, which is more about, as you said, some of that stuff about protecting and strength and that kind of thing, and an opposition to the outside. And the left, of course, is much, much, much less seen as the party of workers now, and is more about those progressive values. So I think that's some of what's going on here. But I think there are many other things that could be contributing to. One thing that we don't discuss a huge amount is that university, right? The number of women who go to university now in pretty much all developed countries, but very much true in the UK as well, is far higher now than the number of young men. So at age 18, 19, it's about 5 women to every 4 men at that age going to university. Now that, it's not as if you go to university and you don't go to university, you then inhabit 2 different universes. Yeah. But that can actually impact people's values, like how they think about the world. It also changes the social groups you operate in. It opens up or closes off different doors to you, and that's going to mean that all of the things being equal, your average young woman is going to be a bit more educated, a bit more have slightly more progressive liberal values as someone who's graduated from university than your average young man.
Are we looking at a blip, do you predict, or is this going to be a long-term trend?
I think this is probably a trend. Now, I think what we should say is we're still talking about a pretty small number of people here, right? The large majority of young people are not part of this dynamic we're talking about. Probably around 80 or 90% are people who hang out, think, act in very similar ways. But I think we are seeing a trend at the fringe with this divide, with a small number of young men who think about things in a very particular way, which often have quite sexist views, and a small number of women who have these very, very progressive values, which are pretty incompatible with that small group of men.
Excellent explanations, John Burn-Murdoch. Thank you. Listening to all that was Dr. Stephen Whitehead. Good morning to you, sir. And if I can go straight to your thoughts on why men and women, albeit on the fringes, are diverging politically.
Well, it's been going on for some time. This is not a new phenomenon, although we're taking note of it over the course of this century. But it actually began, well, we can certainly say it began at the beginning of the last century. It took form and pace after the end of the Second World War. There were talks about a crisis of masculinity with sociologists were talking about this back in the 1950s and 1960s.
No. Okay.
Oh yeah,
okay.
absolutely. And this is not a new conversation that we've been having, but what we're seeing now is a new manifestation of a resistance against women's desire for independence. And when we talk about independence, we're actually talking about women's independence from men, women's independence to live their own lives in a way that suits them, fueled obviously by opportunity, as your previous speaker said. The education shifts. 1.5% of women went to university in my day, back in the 50s and 60s, and it's now the majority, and they're doing better in education from primary through to PhD levels than men globally. So there is something going on here which we have to take note of, and other people have noted. It's a massive gender revolution. In actual fact, this is the greatest revolution humanity's ever seen, and we're only at the beginning of it. Where it's going to head, I don't know, but we certainly are in the middle of it, and this is part of the expression of it.
Can you help me out, sort of, how the sexes, what cues they're picking up? What is it about the right that links to younger men? What is it about the left that in women? What is it about the left that might appeal to them? What are the sort of biological or psychological aspects of their makeup?
Well, getting more women through university, for one thing. And when we see women, when people do go through university, it's likely that they're going to pick up more liberal values. Recent research that came out in the US suggests that 65% of students of whatever gender support DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion and justice, and they're supporting the statement that professors should make a statement, in-person statement in support of this. So that indicates to you that there is a very clear impact on people's subjectivities by going through higher education. And I don't know to what extent these rioters were not at university, but there's clearly a lump of men who are not going through this process who would benefit from it. And on that point, let's make one small point. It's costing the taxpayer £50,000 per annum for every one of those rioters they put in prison for this 12 months. Well said. And it costs £23,500 to educate a student studying medicine for 1 year, £14,000 for STEM subjects, and £10,500 for social sciences and humanities. In other words, for every one of these writers that they're going to have to put in prison, we could fund five free places at university. So for me, the answer is within the education system, but the government needs to recognise it and act on it.
Absolutely fascinating, if I may say so. Eyes have been opened. Dr. Stephen Whitehead, thank you for that. Do you agree? Are we witnessing the start of a revolution?